So now that we understand why The Wrath of Khan is a cinematic masterpiece, and how most of the Star Trek films suffer from a desire to outdo Khan through a process I dubbed the Khan effect, I now want to dive into two great examples of how to include a villain in a Star Trek film properly. And I will share my thoughts as to how Paramount and future filmmakers can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. This is Ketwalski. To begin, let's look at Star Trek VI: Undiscovered Country. So it's no secret that this film was intended to share a direct link to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The film's goal was to showcase how people on both sides of the conflict would react to a sudden desire for a full-on peace accord between the USSR and the United States. You have Gorkon and Spock representing the desire for an end of hostilities, Valeris, Admiral Cartwright, and General Chang representing those who don't believe peace is an option and total victory needs to be achieved, and then you have Kirk, who represents those individuals who have strong reservations about the idea but ultimately come around to it with some minor hesitations. All three groups represented here easily connect with the film's audience because they embody the actual emotions people felt during the end of the Cold War. The end of the war between the Klingons and the Federation is the play in which all of our characters are participating in. All of the actions taken, both good and bad, are connected back to the film's overall plot. So how did this film avoid the Khan effect and stand out on its own? Well, I think it started with hiring back Nicholas Meyer, the director of The Wrath of Khan, who clearly understands the concept of layering in a relatable story to a science fiction film. So let's talk about layers. In Layer 1, the largest layer, is the Cold War story between these two Star Trek factions and the political drama centered around the Federation president. In Layer 2, you have our characters, including our primary villain, General Chang, played by acclaimed actor Christopher Plummer. For Layer 3, you have a murder mystery subplot and a jailbreak sequence for Kirk and McCoy. And finally, Layer 4 is the backdrop of retirement and the fact that the Enterprise is getting decommissioned at the end of the film. This also serves as an unofficial handoff to the next generation crew. So you might be wondering, why I'm bothering to point out the obvious story structure of this film? Well, it's because this structure is built just like an episode of Star Trek, and thus a more relatable film for Trekkies. Think about it. Very few episodes of Star Trek are just about good versus evil, or a primary villain doing bad things that our heroes need to stop. They are built around a more layered story structure, usually with subplots interweaving to the main plot that teaches the characters, and thus the audience, a lesson about morality, life, or whatever it is. This isn't to say that a plot about an unstoppable force, hell-bent on the destruction of the universe, isn't good, but it's not in line with what Trekkies experience on the TV shows up to that point. Typically, the villains or antagonists were part of the story being created just like our heroes. But this is a fine line to walk. Insurrection, for instance, would have worked great as a two-part episode of TNG, but it failed cinematically. Why? Well, honestly, the layering wasn't done well enough, and it devolved into a simple one-on-one fight with an unrelatable villain at the end of the film, without any long-lasting consequences for our heroes or the Trek universe. Nicholas Meyer and Christopher Plummer were able to create a character that people on both sides of the Cold War could connect with and possibly even understand or agree with. It's that relatability and layering that allowed Chang to flourish into a more nuanced villain. His actions are terrible, yes, but he is the product of a decades-long conflict and warrior-like culture. He's acting in a way people would expect, and his motivations are clearly understood. Additionally, Myers took the concept of layering even further by supporting the main villain with multiple antagonists. With Valeris and Cartwright being Layer 2 antagonists, the Romulans coming in at that Layer 3, and in some regards, Kirk coming in at Layer 4. Kirk's anger towards the Klingons for the death of his son pushes him to act in a somewhat antagonistic fashion during the film, which ultimately works against him during the murder trial. This secondary layering was another brilliant move by the filmmakers, and the ultimate reason I believe Chang works so well. Instead of having an all-powerful villain like Khan, you have the audience experiencing different nuances of the Cold War ending through the actions and dialogue of multiple characters acting in relatable but antagonistic fashions, all of which culminated by Chang's desire to assassinate the Federation president at the end of the film, which was a truly villainous act. So that's one way to do a villain that is different than Khan. Now let's take a look at what I would consider to be the complete opposite approach. Star Trek First Contact. This film is all action all the time. It's got a tight script, action-oriented editing and soundtrack, and a very lean-down story. After the lukewarm response to Generation, Paramount was undoubtedly wanting something different to keep audiences interested in the film franchise. So the writers smartly chose a plot that involved the TNG crew's biggest nemesis, the Borg. This allowed the filmmakers to include elements showcased in Voyager and Deep Space Nine without having to give each of those shows their own films yet. Additionally, the revenge plot Picard goes on practically writes itself, even if it's not the character we love and know from the show. In fact, a lot of things are offbeat from the show in many ways in this film. Things such as not including the Enterprise because the Federation suddenly doesn't trust Picard, only having Worf on the Defiant, beaming through their own shields, Picard hearing the Borg in his head, and time traveling right in front of a massive Federation fleet, and all of that just happens in the opening act. So how did this film get away with dozens of bizarre things happening on screen? Well, it's simple. This film is constantly moving forward with multiple ticking clocks happening at once. You have the crew repairing the Phoenix clock, the Vulcan science ship clock, the Borg assimilating the Enterprise clock, and then a literal clock with the self-destruction towards the end. All of which helps keep the audience distracted from the plot holes and poor choices made in the film so they can focus instead on the action. And make no mistake, this is an action film. From the space battles, phaser fights, machine guns, to zero-G sword fighting, this film is all about exciting action. Hell, even the cast has slimmed down and appear to be more fit as to blend into their action-oriented script. There's no layering going on here either. Borg are bad, Federation are good, and we need to stop them. So how does this film avoid the Khan effect so well when it goes against almost everything I praise Star Trek VI for not doing? Well, honestly, it's pretty simple. So simple, in fact, that Paramount already recreated it with Star Trek 2009. The answer is, the movie is fun. It's fun to watch the Sector 001 fight with the Borg. It's fun to visit Earth before the Federation and to see the flight of the Phoenix. It's fun to see Deanna get drunk and Cochrane start dancing. It's fun to see combat sequences on the outside of the ship or watch Picard shoot Borg with a Thompson machine gun. This movie is fun to watch, period. And because of that, there isn't a need for layering of good storylines or plot or villains. It's a simple story about stopping the Borg. While many people would criticize this film for being too dumbed down for Star Trek, it's still one of the most popular one among its fans to watch. Now again, this isn't to say that a film like The Voyage Home or Undiscovered Country aren't entertaining in their own right, but those films are focused on recapturing the essence of the TV show on a big screen, whereas First Contact and eventually Star Trek 2009 were focused on just providing a fun popcorn flick for a wider audience. Okay, so the final question we need to answer here is this. How does a future film director avoid the Khan effect and still create a film that Trekkies will watch and love? Well, the answer is again pretty simple. They need a great script first. Having a solid script and utilizing the existing lore of Star Trek is a surefire win. Having action is a plus with mainstream audiences of today, but it's not necessary. It's proven recently that even slower paced films can generate huge buzz and large box office results. I would also recommend entering into areas that we haven't seen before in Star Trek. A thriller or mystery genre film about a crew investigating a crime within the Trek universe. A spy thriller with Section 31. Or a comedy film that follows people outside the Federation a la Guardians of the Galaxy or Firefly would all be examples of paths not taken yet with the Trek film franchise. All of which, with a great script, could prove to be an even bigger hit than The Wrath of Khan ever was. We will always have our first love, and it will never go away. But I think it's time to move on and experience new things to keep the franchise fresh and boldly go where no Trek film has gone before.